Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Links Incorporated and our great leadership here in Philadelphia, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this town hall meeting on reimagining policing in Pennsylvania. I am so glad to be with you tonight. As you know, the Links organization thrives on the fellowship of its members. We must keep that fellowship strong even when we can't be together in person. So I'm just so grateful for all the Links who took the time to join us tonight. And thanks to everyone who is here for this critical discussion. I think it goes without saying that America is at a critical point in our history, and we must move forward and bring about change in our country. I believe we are ready to do that. As women of color, Black mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, and as leaders in our communities, we have voices, and yes, we are strong. And yes, we can make a difference. And it can start tonight with this remarkable panel that we hear tonight. And again, we have the opportunity to have serious discussion about those things that concern us. Tonight can be the start of a realistic, meaningful conversation about how to create change. And I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to it. But before we do that, it is my pleasure, it is my honor to introduce an awesome, fearless woman who is the Chief Talent Officer for the Connecticut State Department of Education. She also has earned her PhD, Doctor in Educational Policy from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is a member of several civic and community service organizations. She's served on numerous boards. I don't know how she finds time to sleep, but what I love most about her is she lives by the motto, to those whom much is given, much is expected. And she even has spare time, but she has time to travel and to read and do other wonderful things. But it is my delight tonight to introduce to some and present to others, Madam Eastern Area Director of the Links Incorporated, Dr. Shawana K. Tucker.
Thank you so much, Link Lorena, for that warm greeting, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for taking time out to be a part of this discussion this evening around this timely topic and critical topic, reimagining policing in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
We have been living in very difficult times, dealing with two pandemics, one around COVID-19 and the other around racial injustice. We're suffering with a great deal of loss, having to bury loved ones without proper homegoing services, losing jobs at alarming rates, a lack of food and other resources all around this country, and on top of it, having to watch our brothers and sisters murdered in the streets by the very people we look to protect us. Well, tonight, you will hear from some powerful Link sisters, all who are serving in positions that directly impact police reform. Tonight, our focus is on Pennsylvania, but this kind of reimagining, refocusing, and reform must happen across this country. They will focus on federal, state, and city legislation that will make necessary changes in police reform. And finally, we are in store for some real talk as we hear from our sister who leads the fourth largest police department with 6,300 sworn officers and 800 civilian employees. This is the beginning of real reform and real change. As we are called to do, our Link sisters are at the forefront of making a difference. I thank you for committing to be a part of that change by using the information you learned tonight and taking it back to your respective chapters and communities. My sisters, we must stay vigilant and stay focused. These issues will not go away unless we advocate and press forward. We've seen a real movement in our country, and our actions have demonstrated that enough is enough and things must change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eastern Area Director. We appreciate your comments, and I just feel like I can feel a brand new day. So I'm just so excited. But then I get the opportunity to introduce the moderator for our panel tonight, who is a friend, she's a colleague, and yes, she's my Link sister. And it's none other than Evelyn Sample Oates, who is often described as a bridge builder, a motivator, a mover and shaker, a person of resource, the consummate advocate for the voiceless and ambassador for the hopeless. She is one call them the go-to people in Philadelphia to get the job done, according to the Philadelphia Tribune. And she's the right-hand person to Dr. William Haidt, the superintendent of schools, who she is always on call 24/7. So when we asked her about this, she was on call and she said, what a wonderful idea. This is something we need to do. And she also serves as the co-chair of the Legislative and Public Affairs Committee for the Eastern area of the Links Incorporated. So again, I'm delighted and just privileged to introduce my friend, my colleague, my Link sister, Evelyn Sample Oates.
Thank you, Link Lorena. Good evening, Link sisters.
Good evening.
You are in store for a serious conversation tonight around reimagining, refocusing, retooling, and reforming policing. You are going to hear about Pennsylvania, since this is being brought to you by the Delaware Valley chapter specifically, but by the other Pennsylvania chapters as well. And we have some wonderful Pennsylvania lawmakers on our panel tonight. You're going to hear also specifically about Philadelphia, because we do have the top cop, who's one of our Link sisters, the commissioner of the police force here with us tonight. And you will hear about national reform that is taking place, because the problem stretches way beyond Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. This is a deep-rooted issue, a pandemic that we must find an immediate cure for. Our hope is that we all leave this virtual meeting, town hall meeting tonight, better informed and equipped with the knowledge to advocate and to act on police reform and the injustices that people face because the dangerous actions of just a few enforcement officers, certainly not all of them. I will introduce our panelists one by one. You will hear their introductions, and then you will hear a brief opening statement from each of our panelists. Then we will have a series of questions for each of them. At the end, we left a few minutes for questions from you if you have any. So there is a feature at the bottom of your screen in the chat section. Feel free to write your questions in that chat feature. If we don't get to your questions, we will still answer them and get the answers back to you. We want to be responsible and make sure you have the information you need, but we will try our best to leave that extra time at the end for your questions. This is also being recorded, and it will appear on the Eastern Area website in a few days to follow. So you will get a chance to share with your Link sisters who did not get on this call, on this virtual town hall meeting tonight, the information. If you could please just make sure that you stay focused, listen to what they're saying, and I promise you, this is going to help us in our advocacy efforts. Again, thank you for being here this evening. Our very first panelist.
Link,
yes,
I'd like to acknowledge our special guest that we have joining us tonight. Yes. I'd like to thank some special guests for joining us tonight. Our Eastern Area Program Director, Rhonda Crowder, our National President, Dr. Kimberly Jeffries Leonard, the National Executive Council and Board Member, Stephanie Boyd, a committee member from the National Legislative and Public Affairs Committee, Danielle Turnipseed, and then some special acknowledgments, because none of us do this by ourselves, especially to the Pennsylvania presidents who are a part of this work tonight. Philadelphia, the founding chapter, Leah Shepard, Bucks County, Cheryl-Ann Walker, Harrisburg, Mary James, Montgomery County, Forestine Coombs, Pentown, Thais McNeil, Pittsburgh, Terry Clark, and Delaware Valley chapter, my very own Sean Blue. Thank you and welcome for coming to join us. I give it back to you, Link Evelyn.
Thank you, Link Lorena. Our first panelist I'm going to introduce to you tonight is Councilwoman Sherelle L. Parker. She proudly serves the 9th Councilmatic District in Philadelphia, which stretches through Northwest and Northeast communities, including East Mount Airy, West Oak Lane, East Oak Lane, Olney, Lawncrest, Lawndale, Burholme, and Oxford Circle. She was raised by her grandparents. Sherelle's mission to bridge the gap between the have and the have-nots continues to be her driving force for change. She has dedicated her life to using her voice to advocate for the passage of much needed public policies that will enhance the quality of life for the working class, senior citizens, women, children, and families alike, while promoting job creation and sustainability, economic development, an equitable public school system, and consumer protection laws. As chair of Council's Labor and Civil Service Committee, Sherelle is working to ensure that all workers have financial security in their retirement. She is also focused on addressing deteriorating infrastructure and an overall lack of investment in middle neighborhoods, illustrating her passion for neighborhood stabilization and home preservation. Prior to her election to council in November of 2015, Sherelle served for 10 years as a state representative for the 200th Legislative District in Pennsylvania's House of Representatives, where she made history in September of 2005 by becoming the youngest African American woman ever elected. As state representative, she earned a reputation for being one of the most effective, politically savvy, and proactive legislators in the region. She was twice elected by her Philadelphia colleagues to serve as chair of the Philadelphia delegation to the House. And in 2013, she was also appointed vice chair, Democratic chair of the House Committee on School Safety. She is a graduate of both the University of Pennsylvania and HBCU Lincoln University, where she earned a Master of Public Administration and a Bachelor's of Science in English Education. Respectfully, she is a single mother residing in Mount Airy who enjoys reading, traveling, cooking, and spending time with family and friends during her leisure. I present to you Councilwoman Sherelle Parker.
Thank you so very much, Link Evelyn, for that introduction, and hello to all of our Link sisters. Link Shawana, I think you put my opening in perspective when you talked about we in this nation and in this world dealing with two pandemics at the same time. One associated with the novel coronavirus, which causes COVID-19, along with the civil unrest that we've seen in a pursuit for social and economic justice. So with that being said, I want to start with what I don't reimagine policing being in Pennsylvania because of the way I've seen folks control the narrative. And Commissioner Outlaw, you need to know from me for the record, reimagining policing in Pennsylvania does not mean totally abolishing the Philadelphia Police Department. I want to be clear. I want to be on the record about that, because when we've seen people attempt to hijack the narrative associated with the movement, they have attempted to make it appear as if when we say reimagining the police and policing and what it looks like in the future, that's what we're saying. It's not. For me, it's that the men and women who are policing our city, they are a reflection of our city because they are of our city and they are of the people. So demographically, they would look like the people they are policing. They would not be looked at as occupiers of the communities that they are sworn to protect and to serve, that they in essence would be partners in our effort to improve the quality of life and public safety for all citizens. And I would reimagine policing being that way, not just for us here in the city of Philadelphia or across the Commonwealth, but across the U.S.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilwoman Parker. Our next panelist, if you all remember from our flyer that we sent out, and the person who was really the point person on making this happen and bringing this to fruition was State Representative Morgan Cephas. I ask that you please keep Representative Cephas in your prayers. Her father passed away suddenly on Sunday, and today was actually the funeral. So I have been in contact with her, but I ask you, Link Sisters, to just keep her in your prayers, keep her family in your prayers. This was her baby. This was her project tonight. She called me months ago and said, you know, Link Evelyn, can you help us bring this to life? And she worked so hard on everything. And then for this to happen, again, Link Sisters, I ask that you keep her in your prayers on her journey to recovery in this instance. So we've asked tonight one of our other Link Sisters, attorney Ganesha Martin, to join us. And Ganesha is going to bring the perspective from the federal side, and you will hear why we've asked her to speak about the federal side of policing reform. So allow me to introduce our Link Sister, Ganesha Martin, Esquire. Ganesha led the federal court-ordered consent decree reform efforts at the Baltimore Police Department from 2015 to 2018. As chief of the Department of Justice Compliance, Accountability, and External Affairs Division, Martin collaborated with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division attorneys during a pattern or a practice investigation that ultimately led to a consent decree. Martin played an integral role on a negotiation team that introduced structural reforms to the Baltimore Police Department in the areas of crisis intervention, relationships with youth, interactions with persons suffering from mental illness, use of force, and de-escalation, body-worn cameras, mobile data computer technology, hiring and recruitment, community engagement, and officer wellness and early intervention. A pioneer in public-private partnerships that have introduced organizational opportunities for inclusion and equity, Martin is an ambassador who seeks non-traditional relationships to better serve all public stakeholders. She has led police reform efforts around the country and currently leads in the impact campaign for the documentary Charm City, which debuted at the Tribeca Film Festival and was shortlisted for the Oscars and syndicated by PBS Network. She has served in several positions in Baltimore City government, and most recently, she was the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. She has overseen collaborative criminal justice efforts that included the Baltimore Police Department, Baltimore State's Attorney's Office, the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the judiciary and several community groups. Currently, she runs her own consulting firm. Her current work focuses squarely on uniting communities of color and the police who swear to serve and protect them. Her unique ability to connect with both the community and the police before guiding them towards common ground is the hallmark to her success. In addition to Baltimore, she has consulted on consent decree compliance and police reform matters for police departments across the country. She is a highly sought after expert on police reform, and Martin regularly speaks on the Department of Justice consent decrees, police reform and accountability, and public safety. She's a member of the Council on Criminal Justice, an invite-only organization, which is a nonpartisan organization and a think tank for leaders in the criminal justice field. In 2019, she was one of 40 community policing experts invited to Nairobi, Kenya to share community policing strategies during the convening on civilian police reform by Open Societies Foundation. She was also awarded their Securing Open Societies Fellowship in 2019. Martin's expert commentary has been featured in the New York Times, the Baltimore Sun, and the Washington Post, among others. She has been recognized in recent years by the Baltimore Sun in its top 25 women to watch, the Daily Record in its top 100 women, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police in its top 40 under 40. My Link sisters, I bring you attorney Ganesha Martin.
Thank you, Link Evelyn. Wow, that's so crazy when you hear your your bio read. I am so blessed and privileged to be here with my Link sisters and proud that we are coming together to have this conversation and to be able to be helpful in our respective communities. I'm glad that we're here to discuss reimagining policing in Pennsylvania. This is a critical conversation that our voices must be a part of. As Black women, we, along with the men we love, find ourselves constantly on one side or the other of injustice, inequity, and even life or death situations. And this must stop. So the shouts from the streets must turn into sustainable and meaningful action. That requires us to understand the issues, not just be mad, not just be hurt, and not just be exhausted. While the issue affects all of us as people of color, there are Black and Brown communities that suffer disproportionately. We need to get uncomfortable, my Link sisters, and use our privilege and our proximity to power to change things for all of us. I know there has been strong interest in 8 Can't Wait that we'll discuss tonight. Those issues cover banning chokeholds, requiring de-escalation, a duty to intervene, requiring warnings before shootings, exhausting all alternatives before shooting, and banning shootings at moving vehicles. I actually spoke today to one of the founders, Reimagining of 8 Can't Wait, and he was very excited that we were going to be talking about his work tonight and how it can be useful in our communities. As you know, also Senator Kamala Harris and Senator Cory Booker and Reps Karen Bass and Gerald Naylor introduced legislation, the Justice in Policing Act, in 2020. I hope to use my experience in this work to inform what it is you want to do next. It's imperative that we educate ourselves so that the things that we're asking for of our legislators, of our local officials, and quite frankly, knowing how it is that we can support our Link sister. She has a very, very difficult job, and she needs us sometimes to say things that she cannot. And so I hope by the end of this evening, we would have talked about some of the solutions, and then we are very clear on how to help her and our communities enact legislation and other initiatives that will help us all be safer in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Martin. Thank you. Our next panelist, Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw. Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw is an experienced and respected law enforcement leader. She stands at the helm of the nation's 4th largest police department, which employs more than 6,500 sworn officers and 800 civilians who work to help make Philadelphia a safer city. Commissioner Outlaw is the first, she is the first African-American woman to lead the Philadelphia Police Department. A believer in the power of connectivity and continued learning, she meets people where they are. She engages critics and contributes nationally and internationally to ensure the department's narratives are accurately told and to benchmark against the organizations to ensure best practices and contemporary policing here. Her overarching community safety goals are rooted in crime prevention and reduction, organizational excellence, and community engagement and inclusion. Commissioner Outlaw's TED Talk, Humanity in Authority, dispels the belief that the two concepts are contrary in nature and explains how the two concepts can and should coexist. And if you have not seen that TED Talk with our commissioner, please, my Link sisters, take some time after this and listen to it. It is extraordinary. She has also presented on various topics, including race and policing, women and law enforcement, de-escalation and investigation of use of force, building community relationships after controversy, and video recording and policing and early intervention systems. She has been asked to provide technical assistance in areas of police accountability and risk management. Prior to taking the helm as Philadelphia's top law enforcement officer, Outlaw was the chief of Portland, Oregon's Bureau of Police. She was the first African-American woman to hold that post. Commissioner Outlaw began her law enforcement career in Oakland, California, where she spent 20 years in service with the Oakland Police Department. The Oakland, California native has received numerous awards, including the Police Executive Research Forum Award, the Gary P. Hayes Award, the Cascadia Behavioral Health Award, and many, many more, including the Woman of Distinction by the Girl Scouts of Oregon and Southwest Washington. We love our Girl Scouts. Commissioner Outlaw earned a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from the University of San Francisco and a Master of Business Administration from Pepperdine University. She is also a graduate of the Police Executive Research Forum Senior Management Institute of Police, the Major Cities Chiefs Association Police Executive Leadership Institute, and the FBI National Executive Institute. Commissioner Outlaw is a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Human and Civil Rights Committee, and is also an active member of the National Organization of Black Law Executives. She recently joined the Major Cities Chief Association Executive Board as the Eastern Region representative. She continues to demonstrate her civic advocacy through Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated and the Links Incorporated. I am proud, my Link sisters, to introduce to you Commissioner Danielle Outlaw.
Good evening. Thank you, Link Evelyn, and good evening to our Link sisters that have joined us tonight. Thank you so much for being part of such an important topic. And it's not just an important topic for community, but it's an important topic for us. I don't have to recount all of the incidents that led us here. Unfortunately, it took the tragedy of what happened to Mr. Floyd for us to truly come together and take this seriously, where terms were no longer taboo or stigmatized, but now we're starting to see terms like Black Lives Matter a part of the normal narrative. So I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have tonight. And we all know that through crisis comes opportunity. It doesn't have to be all bad. It will be uncomfortable. You know, when there's change and uncertainty, it makes us a little bit uncomfortable in our skin. But this is the opportunity. We ripped off the Band-Aid, the scab is open, and now it's time to heal. And I look forward to working with not only our stakeholders here on the call, but in our communities to really talk about a pathway forward, because we also find that there are individuals that want to come and pound their fingers or their fists on the table, but they don't really want to talk about solutions, right? I'll give you all the time in the world, but let's talk about what we can do to move forward. We all want to be heard, but we have work to do. So I appreciate hearing that, you know, when I hear about our use of our proximity to power, you know, we have an obligation here. But also, Link, Ganesha, to your point, which I really appreciate you pointing out, is that we can't do it alone, right? We're put in these positions, we have seats at the table, but we also recognize, and I recognize, that I'm not going to be able to do this as one person and one voice. So again, I look forward to what we're going to put out here this evening, have some meaningful solutions, and we'll work forward from here.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. So we're going to start our questions, panelists, and I'm going to start with Commissioner Outlaw. Commissioner, you have been described as a as the personification of a current 21st century mindset in police and policing. Experts say that you seem to be a big believer in community policing in a way that allows for policing and humanity to exist in the same space. You connect with the officers you manage because you care, and you care about the communities you are responsible for keeping safe. You apologize publicly when necessary, and you take complete ownership for any missteps that may have occurred under your watch. And upon investigation, you take immediate action to right the wrongs of the organization you're leading. Link Sisters, I want to share this clip with you from a press conference in Philadelphia on June 25th, because the actions of this police commissioner, I've been in Philadelphia a long time, and I've never quite seen it like this. So I want to show and share this with you. Link Aurelia, can you play that clip?
Today's deployment of tear gas was a means to safely diffuse a volatile and dangerous situation and to restore order when it became increasingly clear that other measures were ineffective in accomplishing that necessary objective. In addition, in a subsequent press conference held on June 2nd, 2020, I stated, the option of deploying tear gas was selected only when it became evident that other options were not effective. In the weeks that have followed, I have learned that relative to 676, those statements are substantively inaccurate, as I have now personally viewed video evidence that largely contradicts the material portions of those statements. In making those statements, I relied on information which was relayed to me after the initial deployment of the described munitions, and for that, I humbly apologize to those who were directly impacted, as well as to our communities at large. As recently as today, I have viewed video posted by the New York Times, by which I am extremely disturbed and quite frankly, sickened beyond description. Some of the video depicts our officers utilizing the force instruments gratuitously and in complete divergence from our policy, Directive 10.2, 10-2, which states with specific regard to OC spray, the use of OC spray is not to be used for the dispersal of non-violent persons or disorderly crowds and in situations where people are peacefully exercising their constitutional rights of free speech or assembly. For this unjustifiable use of force, I also deeply and very humbly apologize. And I am committed to repairing the damage that this event has caused to already the very strained police community relations that we have been experiencing. To that end, effective immediately, I am declaring a categorical moratorium on the use of tear gas for the dispersal or control of crowds, which includes any persons who are peacefully assembling or possibly resisting. We are also evaluating all other munitions available to SWAT personnel.
Thank you. So, my Link Sisters, you saw that video clip, and some of you may have seen it on June 25th. This is a police commissioner who took full responsibility. Although she wasn't the one who said use the tear gas, use it. It wasn't her. She didn't make that call. One of her subordinates made the call without her permission, and you saw it afterwards because the gentleman who made the call came up after her, took a demotion, and said he was the one who made the call. He did not get it from the commissioner, which she told him to talk to her before he made any call, but he didn't. But this is a commissioner who took responsibility, who apologized and said, we are going to move forward. We are going to make it better because this was wrong. So I commend her for that. You know, Commissioner Outlaw got here and she came to work in February, mid-February. There was a pandemic in March. She's only been here for 6 months. She's only been here for 6 months dealing with this. So 5 months. But Commissioner, how do you move the police department to engage with the community to strengthen the relationship and change the perception, especially when dealing with people of color, to a more amicable and respectful relationship where they can trust the police?
Thank you for the question. And, you know, I haven't gone back and watched that clip. That day happened and I've been moving ever since. You know, I think follow through is important. Being authentic is important. Recognizing and acknowledging if mistakes are made or if there are things that we could have done better or lessons learned, we need to acknowledge that and be very public with it and do it in real time. You know, we often, you know, we hire consultants to come and do after actions reports, which I think are very important. It's critical. We have an outside set of eyes assessing our response to something. But one of the downfalls of having an outside set of eyes, you know, assess your response is that it can take months. And when you're in crisis, we don't necessarily have the advantage of waiting months for someone to tell us you should have done this better, because it could happen again within hours or in the next day or so. So I think it's important to, you know, be introspective constantly. I believe in being a learning organization. As leaders, we have to be willing to hearing, you know, what we do well, what we don't do well. But I think we have to be authentic. People know when you're trying to be something that you're not. We have to be strategic. We have to anticipate what's coming around the corner. And really have to work to change culture. And the change of culture is not going to happen overnight. I have been here 5 months. But when you talk about systemic issues that took decades to build, you have to chip away at culture through changing of policy, changing of training. You know, there's going to be, you know, rotation of assignments, and people might, you know, attrit, and getting new people on. It takes time. And so while that trust might not build immediately, it's a constant effort in establishing trust and maintaining relationships. This is a relationship, just like a relationship with our family, loved ones, whomever it is. We have to put in work. So along with managing expectations, and again, it's internally and externally. There's a lot of focus when we talk about transformation or reformation. There's a lot of focus on what are you going to do to establish trust, or, you know, to improve your relationship with the community. And we tend to think of our external community, but we forget that there are also internal communities. There's officers here that are impacted by everything that's going on. So as leadership, it's important that not only we communicate with them regularly and keep them in the loop, and especially the larger the agencies, you have to over communicate this. I learned this very quickly. But you have to make sure that you give them everything that they need to be successful and to thrive, whether it's training that they need, the equipment that they need, publicly praising, being consistent in how we discipline and hold people accountable. So it's two communities that we're dealing with. You can't say one thing publicly and turn around and say something else internally, and or vice versa. So I think there's a few things, but again, I think to be very clear, it's a process. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And, you know, being in these seats, we have to recognize that, you know what, we can have some really good days. Sometimes I feel like, you know, we took 10 steps forward and all it takes is one incident, and felt like I just took 20 years back. So again, it's a process. It has to be collaborative, and we cannot continue to work within the level of division that we've been working in as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before I move on, I do have another question that a lot of Link sisters wanted to know. We've been hearing this term defunding the police. That we've been hearing a lot of it. We know that Camden looked at a model like that. I think Oakland did that, looked at a kind of model like that as well. But tell me, how would you describe defunding the police? What does that mean?
Well, you know, you really have to compare apples to apples. A lot of folks ask me a question about, well, what, you know, have you thought about the model that Camden uses? It's not, you know, right? It's not the same. But what I would say is, you know, what a lot of folks are calling for, and let's not get this confused with abolish the police. I think we all agree we need police officers. And quite frankly, I mean, since we're all family, you know, we know that some of the same folks that are yelling to abolish the police are the first ones to pick up and call 911 if something happens, and then they'll complain that we didn't get there fast enough. So I think we need to have a very clear shared understanding that when we talk about defund the police, some folks are talking about take money from the police department's budget and then reallocate that towards other services. Now, I will say this, you know, our budget and Sherelle could tell you, our budget is pretty tight. The majority of our costs are personnel costs. So when you start pulling away funding from a police department, you're laying off bodies, you're laying off police. And during times when we're seeing increases in crime, higher calls for service, I am a firm believer that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but come up with a long-term plan that if we are no longer responding to these calls, then who? What does that look like? What should we be responding to as first responders? Because a lot of us will tell you we shouldn't be responding to a lot of things that we're responding to. But we're a 24/7 operation, and there's really not a lot of entities that are. But, do you call the police for someone that has a kidney ailment? No. You call a doctor. They go on dialysis. It's the same thing. If we start, again, reimagining what public safety means, we'll start looking at some of these issues to truly be a matter of public health. And then you send the appropriate resources. So then you bolster the social services resources with the funding that they need so that the police department in the end or in the long run, the police departments aren't the ones that end up being the catch-all because the other entities don't have the resources to manage. And that's kind of what we're seeing. So again, I don't believe that you should pull funding from us, but I certainly believe that there should be bolstered budgets in these other areas, or even if it's not financial discussion around it, really start to think about who should be first responders to a lot of the calls that we respond to, or should we be co-responders? Because quite frankly, we're still going to have to respond to some calls. If it's someone in crisis, but they're armed, or if there's a threat of harm to them, to themselves or others, we're still going to have to respond.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. We're going to talk about the reform both on the federal, city, and state. Let's start with federal and move over to Attorney Martin. Attorney Martin, give us some highlights of the legislation that was introduced to Congress on police reform.
Link Evelyn, if I could take just actually a point of privilege on two things that the commissioner said. Number one, I want you all to understand that in trying to support her, that police culture is thick. And so I can guarantee you, without having talked to her at all, that the moment that she did that press conference, the trust that she gained with the community, there were police officers in her rank and file, because she is new, and it's going to be some years in trying to building that trust and reducing that culture. She is going to have to be dealing with stuff internally. So I'm just going to say that every time you all see her do something and y'all go rah rah, think about, okay, she still needs our help with a lot of other things that she's having to deal with on the inside. Number one. Number two, on the defunding thing, because we have so many of our Link sisters here that are connected to government, I do want to point out that in social services, in housing, in these other agencies, there is still bias. There are still people that do not see Black bodies as valuable. And so even if we take money from the police and give it to other social services, we still need to be having these conversations about making sure that they're serving our people. So just wanted to say that, 2 cents. Now back to the legislation. So on the federal legislation side, I'm going to obviously give props to Senator Harris and the representatives and the senators that brought that legislation forward. But I want you to know that it's probably not going anywhere. Number one, they put in there, which is something that absolutely has to be brought up. I brought this up in our policing conversation at Assembly in Indianapolis. Nobody really talks about qualified immunity, and nobody really talks about that reasonableness standard. But when we talk about Black men in particular, but Black folks in general that are unarmed being shot, and then the police officers not having any criminal penalties, it is in large part because of the reasonableness standard. It is supposed to be objective, but it turns out to be very subjective. I can go boo. I mean, that's, and if the officer is able to convince the jury that they were scared, then they're justified. And so while I don't think that you should capriciously play with that standard, because then you might not have any police on your force if you take away qualified immunity and that reasonableness standard, because let's keep in mind that when we get up every day, the worst thing that we could do is come onto a Zoom and make a mistake, or have a bad PowerPoint. We are not putting on a uniform and becoming a target and putting our lives on the line and running towards bullets. So we do have to have some protections there for police officers to continue to take those jobs. But I do think that the standard that started, I want to say back in the 1800s, by the way, when we know policing was used, we know what policing was used for, right? And so that standard needs to be examined. The Supreme Court had cases before it. It decided to pass on it. And so while that qualified immunity and the reasonable standard remains in the federal legislation, the Republicans are not letting it go anywhere. The other thing that I really want to point out is we think that our federal government should have some power to deal with local jurisdictions. There's 18,000 police departments in the United States. It's unheard of in other nations. And so in order for them, we've heard about this use of force standard, right? There is no universal use of force standard. So in some places, you can have just where a police officer points a gun to be a use of force, and in other places, not. And so one of the things that they're trying to establish is a standard use of force, but because they have no pull over the police departments, they're trying to entice them with grant funds. The other thing that we've heard about, which is, is a bit crazy, is that the police departments do not have an obligation to actually report uses of force, excessive force, even when that excessive force leads to death. And so again, the federal legislation is trying to force that, but the only way they can do it is through grant funding. And so that's why while we hear these things talked about on a federal level, you've got to be tuned in to your local jurisdictions and asking, well, what is your use of force policy? What is your duty to intervene policy? What is your policy on chokeholds? And then once you get that information, then continue to stay involved and find out what is not only the policy, what is the training, and what are the accountability mechanisms that are utilized within police departments to hold folks accountable. I'll end on this because it ties into the defunding conversation. So one of the things that happens in police departments, many of them are very old in their ways of doing things. And particularly in places like Baltimore, Philly, Chicago, where you have high numbers of deaths. If you have a police commissioner or police chief go to the council or to a mayor and ask for money for technology, they will be looked at crazy. And in particular, in this defunding conversation, don't come over here asking for technology. That sounds cute and pretty. No, let me tell you right now, if you do not have technology that captures your stops, if you do not have technology that captures your uses of force, if Ms. Johnson comes to me and says, Ganesha, they are discreetly stopping young Black men every night on that midnight shift, and I have to go into boxes, I have to go and ask my officers what happened, as opposed to hitting a button and then bringing a report to the commissioner, who could then look at that and be proactive. When you have a commissioner like Commissioner Outlaw, she wants to see those things. She wants to proactively hold her people accountable so that she can make policies and trainings that relate to that. And so that's the other thing. If you don't take anything else away from here, when you hear your chiefs and your commissioners talking about technology, that's something you've got to hold them help them on. Even at raise funds, I had to raise outside funds for it, because you've got to have that to hold police officers accountable and to find those bad apples and root them out before you have something like a George Floyd happen.
Thank you, Attorney Martin. Councilwoman Parker, I see you shaking your head. We're going to come to you now and talk about the local and the state side, because you served in the state for 10 years. So it's appropriate, right, that we come to you and talk about what happened in the state, Harrisburg, what happens in Philly. Can you explain the new legislation that has already been voted on in Harrisburg and what legislation is being introduced around policing? And let's go with Harrisburg first, and we're going to come to Philly. And I believe we have a PowerPoint. Aurelia, can you bring up that PowerPoint so we can talk through what happened in the state side with policing?
So we, as we're working on bringing a PowerPoint up, what we should really do is quickly take a stroll through our history as Black people. How many of us remember the infamous conversation that was made public between A. Philip Randolph and the late President Roosevelt about the president's involvement and engagement in supporting civil and human rights? And they're having that discussion, and they're in the White House, and the president is saying to A. Philip Randolph, Randolph, I'm with you. I support civil rights. Go out there and make me do it. It doesn't make sense, just looking at it on its face. But what he is saying is that the activism that would occur outside is what will make the legislative process and my employing the use of my executive authority as president of the United States, you justify it when the advocacy pushes me to do it. And so when you look at what is listed here relative to Governor Tom Wolf's executive order, you have to give huge props to Representative Morgan Cephas. Let's talk about the dynamic legislators who are representing Philadelphia, and Jordan Harris, our whip, Joanna McClinton, who is our caucus chair, Steve Kinsey, chair of the Black Caucus. Listen, the Black Caucus in the Pennsylvania General Assembly just commandeered the rostrum on the floor of the Pennsylvania House and said that until we address some of these issues that we need to address, we're not going to conduct any business here. As a result of it, we saw a plethora of legislative and policy actions and changes. I would argue, as a former member of that body for 10 years, that would have never passed, that would have never been considered had the environment outside of the Capitol didn't move the policy that was moving on the inside. So first, the governor says, this is what I can do with my executive power. I'm going to create a deputy inspector general within the office of the state inspector general, and it's going to be very specific. They're going to focus on how do we deter, detect, and prevent and eradicate fraud, waste, and misconduct amongst legal law enforcement agencies that are under the governor's jurisdiction. So before you can talk about any other police department policing in the community, Governor, what's happening with those enforcement agencies that are under your purview? In addition, the creation of a state law enforcement advisory commission. Now, some of us here, oh gosh, a solution to a problem. This is government. You just created, another commission. What in the world are you, going to do? But for the first time, the governor has said that this commission will review allegations of misconduct by law enforcement personnel that is under the governor's jurisdiction. Now, before anybody gets cute out there and says, again, Sherelle, if Wolf is no longer elected and another governor comes in and he or she decides that they want to dismantle the commission, because that is something that can happen when an executive issues an order. Let me just say this to you for the record. There are some counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that do not have their own police departments. They rely solely on the Pennsylvania State Police as their police department. And so with that in mind, there is now a vehicle to sort of just review any allegations of misconduct regarding those personnel under the governor's purview. The technical assistance, extremely important. The PCCD, that's our PA Commission on Crime and Delinquency. A lot of work there relative to our local citizen advisory boards. And listen, for the record, and Ganesha, I know you know this well in your work, you can create as many citizen advisory boards you want. If you don't employ them with the financial resources they need to hire the investigators and the staffs that they need to do their jobs, you really have done absolutely nothing. In addition to that, the review, the training, and the education of the officers related to their current use of force, and trying to develop a model. That's extremely important as it relates to training along with the standards. Let me go to the next slide, because this is meaty and this is what was game changing in Pennsylvania. The 2020 legislation has passed. I'm going to keep on moving, but let me say to you, this is what they were able to achieve. We will now in Pennsylvania have departments sharing the employment records of law enforcement. Sherelle, what happens? Sherelle, I just developed as an officer in Philadelphia a pattern of employing the unconstitutional use of stop and frisk. That means, Sherelle, whenever I as an officer stop people, I wasn't stopping people because I sort of had just cause or there was a reasonable suspicion. I stopped people because they were Black or they were brown and for some other reason other than reasonable suspicion. Well, I now also have gotten in trouble because, you know, I've been brought up on charges for using excessive force. And I think I'm going to leave this department and I'm going to go over to Pittsburgh. And then I go to Pittsburgh after I'd already done this in Philadelphia. And who's been conducting sort of or tracking what my track record or folder or jacket is like when I'm moving from one jurisdiction to the other. That will now be shared with employment records that will follow our law enforcement officials wherever they are. Mandatory training in policing, recognizing and reporting child abuse, interacting with people of diverse racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds, de-escalation, harm reduction. We've heard that a lot. In addition to that, trauma-informed care and recognizing post-traumatic stress disorder. We can't say enough how many people we've heard of who've had mental challenges, who have needed mental health counseling, people who have dealt with substance abuse issues, who have not gotten the supports that they need. We call on law enforcement to go out to the scene to address an issue when what we really needed was a therapist. We needed a psychologist. We needed a doctor. We needed a substance abuse counselor. We needed someone other than law enforcement there. And now that training will be available. Mandatory evaluation of police for post-traumatic stress disorder within 30 days use of force. Let me say this to you, and I want to be clear about this. There were some people who were really angry with me when I raised this issue during a budget hearing. And Commissioner, this was before you arrived. When we started talking about who we were hiring, I wanted to know who was conducting the psychological evaluations, what firm, and when they were conducting those psychological evaluations, was cultural competency a metric?
Did we lose her? Councilwoman?
You can't hear me?
Now we can.
Okay.
Go ahead. You're fine.
What indicators were used to determine whether or not you were mentally stable and fit to do the job? I would argue that there has even been bias. And listen to this, Ganesha, the selection of the firms who are chosen to do the psychological evaluations on the people who are being hired to work in the department. What have been the barriers to entry for making sure that the department does reflect Philadelphia, right? And so all of these issues were addressed in the litany of proposals. I know that Link Evelyn is going to make available all of the awesome slides that Link Morgan Cephas has provided for us today. But this is what I want you to know. Number 2 on here, I want you to look at this. Reforming the 1968 Act 111 binding arbitration with an emphasis on removing disciplinary procedures and investigations from the process. For anyone who says, I don't understand how a police officer could be involved in any sort of act or behavior that would call for, let's say, Commissioner Outlaw fired some people for the use of excessive force. She made that executive call. She made that decision. And the next thing you know, they go through an arbitration process. And what Commissioner Outlaw just did in firing them and saying out the door, she turns around. She said, wait, I just fired you. And how did you get back in here? They use that Act 111, that binding arbitration process. And we'll talk about that at another time, but I want you to make sure that you pay attention to that. Now, this is a final one. Increasing penalties for individuals who file a false police report with malicious intent. How many of you can remember the Karen calling the cops on the gentleman who was bird watching in New York, right? You remember that? Listen, that was not an isolated case. That has happened all over the nation. And so, I have conversations, quite frankly, with folks. And I said, I am so happy to see so many people joining this movement for social and economic justice for Black people and wholeheartedly embracing that Black Lives Matter. I want, when they leave Philadelphia and they go back home to the main line, I hope Black Lives Matter enough to you so that you don't decide to call law enforcement on someone who doesn't look like they belong in your community before you make a determination about going to make that call. Finally, that was state. I have to now link Evelyn. I had to do 2 jobs, so let's just
tell us about city. Yeah, tell us about city.
That was Link Morgan Cephas. This is what was important to us. And Link sisters, I want you to know we caught hell. We caught hell for doing this. The city of Philadelphia used to have as a primary rule that if you wanted to be a city of Philadelphia civil service employee, you had to be a resident of our city. For some odd reason, don't ask me how. Don't ask me when. Well, I know how, when, I just can't have that conversation here. The law changed. And now I'm not expecting any of you who work in law enforcement to share my perspective on this. So because Commissioner Outlaw and I may agree to disagree on this, right? Some people would say, Sherelle Parker, you're talking about, requiring not current people, but going forward, any new people coming through the academy who make it through the process and get on the force, you're saying that they should be residents of the city of Philadelphia. Well, Sherelle, you're now going to shrink the pool of those who are qualified because you just said, I can't go outside the city. You have to live in the city. I would argue this. Number one, if we need to make an adjustment, there is a waiver. There is a waiver that you can apply for. If you are not a resident and we are in any way, shape, or form needing the very special skill set that you, would provide, we have access to a waiver process that would give us the ability to bring you in. In addition to that, aside from residency, I believe the requirement. It will ensure that the taxpayers that are paying the salaries of the people who are sworn to protect and serve us, we want them living on our blocks. We would argue that it makes a difference when police officers and firefighters live in the neighborhoods and serve in the communities that they work to protect on a daily basis. In addition, here from an economic perspective, and we can't refute this, if we're paying your salary and you have an opportunity to serve us, we want that dollar to be recycled as many times as possible within the Philadelphia economy. Because quite frankly, our tax base is suffering right now. And not only did it make good sense for policing, but it made good sense economically for our city. In addition to that, Link Sisters, I want you to know this. Everybody talked about, and this was something that really, really bothered me. And Commissioner Outlaw, you weren't here for this, but I know you know it since you've been here. The last election, how many times did you hear people say, I want to abolish stop and frisk? We should end stop and frisk. And it bothered me so much because, you know when someone is politically grandstanding about an issue. I would hear people use it because it's a very emotionally charged issue. But I would get so angry because they wouldn't explain to people what it meant. And the fact of the matter is that even if she wanted to, the mayor could give an order saying that I say that the use of stop and frisk is no longer a policing tool. And if a police officer who thought he had the reasonable suspicion to stop someone on the street for whatever the suspicion was, he has the right. And he's not empowered by Philadelphia law. He's not empowered by state law. He's empowered by federal law, a Supreme Court ruling that gives them the right to use reasonable suspicion as a call to stop someone. Now, with that being said, we know, because we have a consent decree here too, Ganesha, relative to stops and frisks. So now we have Philadelphia, we have law enforcement, along with the ACLU, good friend of mine, Dave Rudowski, Michael Cord. You know, they work all very hard on proving that there was an indiscriminate sort of use in stop and frisk being applied to the lives of Black and brown men and women versus others. And we proved that that was the case in Philadelphia. So this year, what we did, long before the civil unrest and the global pandemic, we put a ballot measure that you will be able to vote on here in the city of Philadelphia that says we're calling on the police department, the city of Philadelphia, to abandon the use, do away with the use of unconstitutional stop and frisk. Sherelle, why do you keep saying unconstitutional stop and frisk versus constitutional stop and frisk? Because it's a legal policing tool. If somebody, knocked on your door, Shawana, and you weren't there, and they opened it and took the television out of your den, and one of your neighbors said, I saw someone with the television leaving Shawana's house, and he or she had on a green shirt with white polka dots, and they had that television. Well, when you call the police and you tell them about that green shirt with white polka dots, you want them to stop that person, especially if they have that television in the hand. The challenge has been this: even when that report about the green shirt and the white polka dots have been made, guess what? It becomes a problem when there are 100 people with green shirts and white polka dots, and the only ones you decide that you want to stop are the ones who are Black or Hispanic. So that is going to be on the ballot. In addition to that, we will also have a public oversight committee. Councilman Curtis Jones did an awesome job there. We will also ban the use of excessive force in the forms of chokeholds. And that legislation has been introduced not just at the local level, but also in the state level. So there's a plethora of legislative initiatives that have been introduced. We will email all of that to you so that you can have it and make reference to it in your work. I just want to say this to you: all of it is done and was done with the power of what took place outside of the building. The outside activism moved the policy on the inside, and that's how we were able to achieve some. And this is not all of what we should or could be doing, but it is definitely a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. We're going to run out of time in a minute, so now I'm going to hurry up and get a couple more questions in. Let me go back to Commissioner Outlaw. Commissioner Outlaw, we said this earlier, you are the first woman, the first Black woman to lead this police force. And we know this is the Good Old Boys Network in Philadelphia. We know that. And we know that you did not want to commit to a plan before you came here because you didn't want people to hold you to that. You needed to see. But I'm sure you didn't expect the pandemic either when you first got here. But tell us, how are you planning to change some of this policy, reimagine this policy, and turn things around? Because I know you're big on social media and technology as well. So how do you plan to turn some of this around in Philadelphia?
You know what? It's funny that you mentioned that. I had almost forgotten how folks kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing for a plan. Almost, but not really. So You know, there's a lot of things that come along with being a first. A lot of folks ask, well, what's it like to be the first? You know, first of all, it's sad that we're still having first in 2020. Second of all, I get I wouldn't even call them microaggressions, they're just flat out overt. I'm asked questions that they never would have asked my predecessors. No one would have pressured my predecessors for a plan for 30 days and then unprecedented pandemic. No one would have, continued to drill on, how are you leading your department? How are you leading your department? I don't even ask me about that. You repeat that? How about now?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, I just stopped talking for a minute, so I guess all that to say, I did exactly that. I said within my first 30 days, I would take a look at, what we already do, what we do well, what we need to tweak, what needs to be thrown out. And then going back as it related to crime, I said, you know what, when were our crime levels the lowest? I want to go back and look at what the strategies were then. When did we stop doing those strategies if we knew that they worked? And then obviously bringing in my experience to introduce things that worked well in my past lives. Having come from police departments that were under consent decrees, a lot of agencies, a handful of police departments that are already working within national best practices because originally they were forced to do it. And then other departments began to come and flock to them because either they wanted to be proactive or they saw a consent decree on the horizon. All of that to say, pandemic happened, but it didn't stop the work. So an action plan was actually put together. It's been published. I think it's almost been about 4 weeks now. But I think what people were expecting from me were a violence reduction plan, and that's it. And I said, no, we need a strategic plan, but it has to be comprehensive. When you mention my 3 pillars, organizational excellence, crime prevention and reduction, community engagement, and inclusion, all of those things are interrelated. And you can't have one without the other. You can't reduce crime if you don't include and engage your community. And you can't have the best strategy on the planet if you don't have the people to implement the resources to implement that strategy. So that's organizational excellence, looking at everything inward to make sure that we're operating at our peak. Organizational excellence encompasses everything that we were talking about earlier as it relates to culture. Do we have the right people in the right seats? What's the organizational structure look like? Who's in your leadership positions? How are they impacting the culture? What's their leadership styles? Span of control, right? What are our accountability mechanisms that we have in place? What systems do we have in place? I was quite shocked, again, to learn, given a department of our size, we have an EAP program, but we don't have a robust peer support program. So again, we're putting all these things on the weight, the weights, the shoulders of our employees here. And I say, by the way, do all these things. Some of them may be new, some might be uncomfortable, and go do it with a smile, right? And that totally discounts everything that they're having to deal with. Are they properly trained? Do they have the equipment that they need? We don't have an early intervention system here, which is problematic. Going back to what Ganesha was saying, not just taking, having the ability at a press of a button to mitigate risk and look at where there's potential risk for, officer misconduct or poor performance, but also what works really well. What are positive indicators and how can we take that, replicate that? I used to like to say, put it in a bottle and sell it. But how do you replicate that throughout the organization? Are you looking at use of force to arrest ratios? Are you looking at, or even using algorithms, right? Some people use thresholds, some people use algorithms. But are you mitigating your risk? So there are a lot of things that go into it. And another key thing, again, we were talking about arbitration. That's one piece, that kind of contractually binds us. But it's become problematic when we see management rights being negotiated into contracts. I'm not anti-union by any means. Union leadership, they have roles to play, they have membership to represent, but working conditions are working conditions. We're not talking about hours or pay here, right? I need the ability to move people around as I see fit. I need the ability to transfer folks out of assignments, one, there's potential for burnout. But if somebody's really not performing in the way that they should, after being given all the resources that we can possibly give them, I need to move them. Again, have the right people in the right seat. I need to make sure as a leader that I'm setting people up for success. But right now, contractually, I do not have the ability to do that. I have to go and meet with the FOP and pretty much ask, is this cool? Can I move such and such over here? Right? Or, narcotics and internal affairs, I have the ability to rotate a percentage, randomly rotate a percentage of individuals out of those units, but I have to sit down and confer with the FOP prior to doing that. So there's a lot of things systemically that need to be addressed. And I think now is the perfect opportunity to be able to do that. Going back to Ganesha's point, please believe that when I'm doing these things, it doesn't necessarily win me brownie points, right? So it's helpful to not only have internal support, because there are a lot of folks, and we have to remember too, sometimes we hear things from union leadership that doesn't necessarily align. The union doesn't speak for me or the department. I speak for the department. And I think the public needs to be, aware of that. But with that said, unions, a lot of unions, the majority of their membership, or the most vocal, the small but vocal minority, are retirees. A lot of new officers are hungry for a new way of doing business, and say, oh, well, you know what, that perspective doesn't necessarily represent me. And it frustrates them because the general population thinks that because one person is speaking out on behalf of the membership, that they also espouse these beliefs. So with that said, it has to be strategic. Again, it has to be very careful. I do have a plan in place. In addition, now, we have some reform efforts that will also be incorporated into, but I hit the ground running. And again, I'm not going to wait for legislation to tell me what I know needs to be done.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. Let me go, Attorney Martin, very quickly, and then I have a question for all three of you because we're going to run out of time. But tell us very quickly, because I know our national organization stood with a group of other national organizations, women organizations, to address some issues that we're dealing now with racial injustice. But can you very quickly tell us about this 8 Can't Wait and what it entails? Can you tell us about that quickly?
Yeah, so 8 Can't Wait. So DeRay and the folks that work with him started their organization in 2015. And that's something that I caution us about, because we look at 2015 and there was a lot of movements after the death of Freddie Gray, after the death of Mike Brown, after several deaths of unarmed Black men. And here we are again 5 years later having the same conversations. And so while 8 Can't Wait is great, because I think it speaks to all of the folks that, as the councilwoman said, all of the action that happens in the streets, it needs to now translate into actual policy change and training. And by the way, kudos on all of that stuff that you got done, because wow. But these things are easy things to ask for, not always easy things to implement. And it sounds like some of these things have already happened locally there in Philadelphia. One is, and I'll pause on just a couple because I know we have only a few minutes. Yes. One is the duty to intervene. The duty to intervene, that's something that everybody has been talking about since the murder of George Floyd. Why those officers stood by and did nothing. And I swore when I saw that video that they couldn't possibly have a duty to intervene, but they did. And so one of the things I want to emphasize here is that if there is a duty to intervene in your local jurisdiction, the next thing is, how do we make sure to support those officers who actually do stand up? Can we protect their pension? Can we make it such that they are not demoted and put on, a midnight shifts? Because what happens is, and think about in any of your work environments, I even use McDonald's as an example. If you have somebody that you see stealing fries, you're new on the job, but you know that the manager carries that person home at night, they stop for a beer. Are you going to tell the manager that somebody just stole those fries? You're not. So these people's livelihoods are online, they're for their family. And so we've got to think about, and you have these conversations with your chiefs and your commissioners, what can I do to help support you in supporting those officers when they do stand up? Because it's not that easy. just period, but certainly in policing. Also require a warning before shooting. That sounds very basic, does it not? Okay, so we want to make sure that that's part of the policy. Exhaust all alternatives before shooting. Again, that sounds very simple, but in a police mind, you've got to have to understand that police training from the beginning was you go home safely, not we go home safely, and also command and control. And what police often are taught is that if you do not command and control that situation, you will die. And so if you have that pummeled into your head, day after day after day in an academy, then you are going to treat everyone as a potential threat to your life. And when you do that, you might jump to, shooting somebody that's unarmed. And so that really was a mind bend for a lot of police departments. You have to have specific training by people who know what they're doing, who believe in this concept, to actually train your police officers to exhaust all alternatives before shooting. We actually had to do a tricky name called tactical repositioning, because if you tell them just de-escalation, then they're like, that's too frou-frou, okay? So you want to make sure that that's happening. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. Again, that sounds very simple. Don't shoot at somebody that's driving a vehicle. And while most best practices, agree with that, there does need to be some conversation about when somebody is using a vehicle, like in the protest that we saw, 2 years ago, using a vehicle to kill and maim. And so while a general ban is a best practice, you also do have to talk about some exceptions. The use of force continuum, this is super important. You would not believe it, but the use of force, as I said earlier, is not universal. And that is what often leads to excessive force and death. And what often happens with police officers is that you start at a certain level, you come on, you're yelling at people, you already started an escalated situation, and then you continue to escalate and you continue to escalate. The best practices with the use of force continuum is you might have to come on the scene and start at a high level, but if you bring that person down, then you come down with that person. You don't have to continue to escalate, and your use of force should be proportional to the resistance, right? So you've got to think about that, and you have a duty to conceal and to cover. So you might, if you run up on somebody with your gun drawn, then they might react in an aggressive way. Get out of your car, assess the situation, and have the mentality that the human life is sacred. And that's what we're trying to preserve. But that's really something you have to, again, really, really teach. The other thing is comprehensive reporting. You have some agencies that do not report uses of force, all uses of force. And so in conclusion, because I feel you, Link Evelyn, you're trying to keep us on track here.
Yes.
Look up A Can't Wait. It's very simple. And what I would simply do is look and see if your policies in your local jurisdiction have these things. And if so, hoorah, you want to make sure that it's actually trained and accounted for. If not, you want to have a conversation about implementing some of these things.
Thank you, Ganesha. I have one final question. And it's going to be, I need you all to answer in 1 minute. And it's going to be their answer to this question and your final statement all in one. As women, we belong to a lot of different organizations. So what is it that you all each think we can do as Black women individually and collectively in our groups to move this reform, to reimagine this policing and to do things better, so we don't have the George Floyd and the Freddie Grays and the Michael Brown incidents? What can we do? You got 1 minute. I'm gonna start with you, Sherelle Parker, Councilwoman Parker. What can we do? You're on mute, Councilwoman. Okay. I'm going to end with Commissioner Outlaw, but go ahead, Attorney Martin. What can we do?
So one of the things is you absolutely, first of all, when you have a Black female commissioner, y'all just need to support her in every way possible. You need to sit down, you need to ask her, what does she need? What does she need you to say? What does she need you to advocate for in legislation? And how can you raise money for her? Because when she is talking about these budgets and all of these community events and all these things that we have to do with mental health and behavioral health crisis, I had to go beg, borrow, and steal from foundations for that. And so those are some things. I would also say to have conversations around this discipline. because when you have officers that you want to get rid of, I was on a panel the other day with another police chief, fired 2 police officers who were dangerous, and then through arbitration were put right back into the force. And imagine all of you, you have children, and then you tell your children no, and then somebody told your child that they can tell you yes. Yes, Link Shawan, you see that exactly. And that's what she's having to deal with. And these are people with guns and badges in communities that they are brutalizing. And so, you know, that's one thing that I think we don't talk about enough. And so figuring out how to help with that disciplinary issue, taking away her management rights, your chief's management rights, I think is a huge issue that we should focus on.
Yes, which is a big union issue in Philadelphia, but absolutely. Thank you. Councilwoman, are you off mute?
Yes,
1 minute.
I will quickly just say this. I'm familiar, Link Evelyn, with the working together that you described, and I was so excited because people are accustomed to all of these organizations sort of working in silos. But when we all stay focused on a unified mission, whatever it may be, it will never allow someone else to come in to hijack the agenda for what is supposed to be a movement that is impacting us, our communities and our families. I would say that in addition to that, it's not just the Commissioner Outlaws. I don't care where we live across this nation. We have Keisha Bottoms, we have Lori Lightfoot, we have Black women who have been elected mayors of cities across this nation. And wherever you see a Black woman that is a Black woman in leadership, I would argue that in some way, shape, or form, she's under attack, and we need to keep our eyes open when we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Commissioner Outlaw, what can we do as women to move this change?
I think it's all been said. Support, not just of me, but for those of us who are in these seats, and we're expected to change the world and fix everything that's been wrong for hundreds and hundreds of years on our own. So support, but support each other and work in collaboration. I've walked into so many rooms and spent so much time unnecessarily when I could have gone into one room working with everybody together. So again, it's not a competition. I think if we, recognize that we're all working towards the same goal, we might agree to disagree. We'll get a lot farther.
And Commissioner Outlaw, let me just say that there are things that you can't say and you can't do, but we can. So lean on us, lean on your Link sisters, lean on, your sorority sisters, all the Divine Nine. We as women support each other. We support you. We don't want you to leave, and we want you to be successful.
I'm not going anywhere.
Lean on us. Good. Lean on us. And I just want to say thank you all of the panelists. We're going to go to our final remarks, our charge, and then our Eastern Area Director is going to close it out. But I do just want to thank Aurelia Williams, who's on this call, our extraordinary Eastern Technology team. She leads that. And Nicole Venable, who is my partner, the co-chair for Legislative and Public Affairs, who got Attorney Martin for us at the last minute. Thank you. I want to thank Selena McAfee from Delaware Valley Chapter, who did the beautiful invitation and flyer. And of course, we have to thank our extraordinary Eastern Area Director for allowing this to happen and being so supportive of our mission and our ideas. So thank you so much, Eastern Area Director Shawana. Thank you for your just everything, your sisterliness and everything. Shawana Tucker Sims, thank you. I'll let you give our charge, Marina.
Okay. All right. After hearing all this tonight, I am confident that we have the leadership needed to help find these answers. But Ganesha, you said something that's just stuck in my spirit. It said, take our privilege and proximity to power to do the following. And there are 3 things that I want you to do. One is the census. If you have not done your census, you need to do it. You need to take people to sign up. They can go online, and the date for final information to be in is October 31st, 2020. But people our representatives are elected. There are different things, the money that comes to the city. So it's important that you be a part of the census. The second thing is, I think it goes without saying, not if we vote, but when we all vote. And we're working in collaboration with our First Lady, Michelle Obama, on that campaign where it's about register to vote, pledge to vote. Check your registration, but it's important that you vote. And for the state of Pennsylvania, the last day to register to vote before the election is October 19th. And then last day to apply for a mail-in ballot, so a lot of people are doing it, is October 27th. And the last day to get that ballot in is actually on November 3rd, 2020 by 8 p.m. And that is the day of the general election. And then finally, you heard Ganesha talk all about 8 Can't Wait. We can't encourage you enough. The website for it is 8can'twait.org to find your city, call your mayor, and demand change right now. You have to be a part of the solution. So again, I thank you for the opportunity, and I'm just excited and just standing on tiptoe expectation on what's going to happen. And with that, I now give the final remarks to our Eastern Regional Director, Sharana Tucker-Sims.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, my sisters. Thank you all for serving as panelists this evening and sharing thought-provoking and necessary information. I also thank our guests that have joined us this evening. I appreciate Link's Lorena Marshall Blake and Morgan Cephas, even though we know she's here in spirit with us, for implementing this idea. And thank you to our Eastern Area Co-Chair of Legislative and Public Affairs, Link Evelyn Sample Oates, for moderating. Thank you to Delaware Valley Chapter under the leadership of President Sean Blue for sponsoring this town hall. My Link sisters, I pray that you stay safe, you stay focused on what we must do. In the words of the late great civil rights icon, Congressman John Lewis, create some good trouble, necessary trouble, so we can make a change in this world. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.